Imagine this. A battle-hardened Japanese soldier, trained to believe that surrender meant shame, sits at a wooden table inside an American prison camp. He expects torture, starvation, maybe even execution. Instead, an American guard hands him something unimaginable: a hamburger, a side of golden French fries, and a glass bottle filled with an ice-cold fizzy liquid called Coca Cola. In that moment, more shocking than defeat itself, he isn't staring at an enemy. He's staring at abundance. A culture built not on scarcity and sacrifice, but on mass production, comfort, and efficiency. What Japanese prisoners of war encountered inside U.S. camps during World War II wasn't just captivity. It was a glimpse into a future they never thought possible, one that would eventually transform Japan itself. Before we dive in, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our deep dives into hidden history. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. The war was ending, but for Japanese prisoners of war, the shock had only just begun. Imagine stepping off a transport truck, exhausted, wounded, and convinced you were walking into a death sentence. For years, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army had been told that Americans were brutal, merciless, and weak. They expected cruelty or starvation. Instead, what greeted them was something no battlefield rumor had prepared them for: hamburgers sizzling on griddles, French fries salted and steaming in cardboard containers, and bottles of Coca Cola clinking with ice. For men who had been living off moldy rice balls and foraged scraps, the sight was almost incomprehensible. The first bite of an American hamburger was not just food, it was a revelation. The disbelief was palpable. Many prisoners at first refused to touch the meals, fearing they were poisoned or some cruel trick. In Japan, capture was synonymous with dishonor. Survival after surrender was unthinkable. Yet hunger eroded suspicion, and one by one, prisoners dared to try what the guards offered. The reactions were unforgettable. The sweetness of Coca Cola fizzing down their throats, the greasy richness of beef, the crisp crunch of fries. These flavors carried no cultural precedent. They weren't just unfamiliar, they were otherworldly. Some men broke down in tears, not from joy, but from the sudden recognition of what they had been denied during years of war: abundance, comfort, and a world beyond scarcity. What made this moment so jarring wasn't only the food itself, but the casualness with which it was served. For Americans, hamburgers and soft drinks were everyday items, hardly worth a second thought. Guards tossed away half-finished sandwiches, discarded bottles with soda still inside, and scraped plates into bins. To Japanese prisoners who had been raised to treat every grain of rice as sacred, this indifference bordered on madness. How could a nation at war afford to waste so much? And if they could do this for prisoners, men who had been sworn enemies just days before, what must life be like for American citizens back home? The question lingered, heavy and unsettling. This cultural collision was about more than taste. It was a confrontation between two worldviews. Japan had entered the Pacific War believing in the Bushido spirit, that courage, endurance, and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The hamburger and Coca Cola meal told a different story. It revealed that America's strength wasn't simply military might, but the ability to mass-produce comfort itself. Food, medicine, uniforms, even leisure. Everything was standardized, abundant, and efficient. To Japanese soldiers who had marched hungry across jungles and watched comrades waste away from malnutrition, this industrial abundance looked less like softness and more like an unshakable foundation of power. For many, this first encounter created a deep inner conflict. They had been taught to despise American consumer culture as decadent and weak. Yet here it was, feeding them better as prisoners than they had been fed as loyal soldiers of the emperor. The experience chipped away at their beliefs. Private Kenji Nakamura, who later recalled his time in an American camp, put it bluntly: "We had been told Americans were weak because they loved comfort more than honor. But when I saw how much they could produce, I realized we had been fighting a war we could never win." That realization didn't arrive in a classroom or through military analysis. It arrived between bites of a hamburger, in the fizz of Coca Cola, and in the careless clatter of food tossed into a trash bin. In hindsight, this shock of abundance was the first step in a much larger transformation. The prisoners weren't just tasting American food. They were tasting America itself, a society built on productivity and plenty. It was an awakening as profound as defeat itself, one that would stay with them long after the war ended. For now, in the summer of 1945, these men sat stunned at picnic tables inside camps scattered across the United States, chewing slowly, glancing at each other in disbelief. They had expected captivity to strip them of dignity. Instead, it offered a vision of a world so far beyond their own that it felt almost like science fiction. The hamburger and Coca Cola would become legends among Japanese POWs, not just for their flavor, but for the truth they revealed. The war had never truly been about who fought harder. It was about who could build more. When Japanese prisoners first stepped inside American camps, it felt as though they had crossed not just an ocean, but a century. On one side stood Japan, a nation that had built its military strategy on discipline, sacrifice, and spiritual conviction. On the other stood the United States, a country whose strength seemed to flow from factories, railroads, and a culture that could mass-produce everything from bullets to bubble gum. The contrast was staggering. For the prisoners, each meal, each uniform, and each casual display of abundance was a reminder that they were no longer just soldiers. They were witnesses to two clashing civilizations. Japan's wartime philosophy was rooted in scarcity. From the earliest days of the Pacific Campaign, Japanese soldiers carried rice balls, dried fish, and, when fortune smiled, pickled vegetables. Resupply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles, leaving many units starving or scavenging. Survival demanded improvisation, repairing weapons with scrap metal, stitching uniforms by hand, and cooking whatever could be pulled from jungle terrain. Hunger was constant. Disease spread quickly. The Bushido Code taught them to endure these hardships, even to see them as proof of honor. To surrender was shameful. To die hungry was noble. This was the world the prisoners had come from. The United States fought with a very different toolkit. America's factories had become engines of war unlike anything the world had seen. Automobiles' lines turned into tank lines, refrigerator plants into aircraft assembly halls, bottling companies into suppliers of soda and rations. American soldiers were not only given weapons, they were given chocolate bars, canned meat, chewing gum, and instant coffee. And when those same supply lines extended to prisoner of war camps, they didn't shrink in generosity. For the Japanese, the experience was like watching abundance industrialized and institutionalized, where even enemy soldiers were beneficiaries. This clash of worlds was not just about logistics, it was psychological. Japanese prisoners had believed that the spirit of sacrifice could outweigh industrial might. Yet here, in places like Camp Shelby and Camp McCoy, they saw evidence that America's strength was not rooted in ideology, but in infrastructure. A single camp could feed, clothe, and house thousands of prisoners with routine ease. Trucks rolled in daily with fresh supplies while kitchens turned out meals that seemed endless. What the Japanese saw wasn't softness. It was a kind of resilience they had never imagined, the resilience of a nation that could turn production itself into a weapon. The prisoners found themselves caught between pride and awe. On one hand, they felt the sting of humiliation, realizing their homeland had sent them to fight without the means to truly sustain them. On the other, they couldn't help but marvel. How was it that Americans could live in such ease, even while fighting wars on two fronts across the globe? To the Japanese mindset, shaped by centuries of frugality and scarcity, this abundance was almost supernatural. It forced them to reconsider long-held assumptions. Perhaps victory wasn't about who was willing to sacrifice more, but about who could provide more. The collision of these two worlds marked a turning point in perception. For the Americans, hamburgers and Coca Cola were ordinary, symbols of daily life. For the Japanese, they were proof of something far greater, that America had tapped into a power that went beyond weapons or soldiers. It was the power to create plenty where others only knew want. In that realization lay the seeds of transformation. These camps weren't just holding pens for defeated soldiers. They were classrooms where an entire generation of Japanese prisoners began to understand why their empire's war had been doomed from the start. The first major wave of Japanese prisoners arrived in American hands after the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal in late 1942. For U.S. forces, the battle was a turning point in the Pacific. For the captured Japanese, it was the beginning of an education in a world they had never imagined. These men were not the broken, demoralized soldiers their captors might have expected. Many were elite Marines, aviators, and paratroopers, fighters who had once stormed beaches, toppled colonial garrisons, and seemed unstoppable. Now transported across the ocean to places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin or Camp Livingston in Louisiana, they were stripped of weapons, but not of their pride. And yet, pride soon gave way to astonishment. Processing into American custody was a shock in itself. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, showers, and thorough medical examinations. Sergeant Yukio Matsumoto, wounded in Saipan, later recalled how American doctors cleaned his wounds with supplies he had never seen before. Bandages arrived sealed in sterile packaging. Syringes gleamed with precision, and shelves held endless bottles of medicine with neat printed labels. Even Japan's best military hospitals, by 1943, were running out of the most basic equipment. For men accustomed to shortages, the sheer order and abundance of these facilities felt surreal. But the food left an even deeper impression. The first meals for many Japanese prisoners were nothing short of cultural shocks. Instead of thin rice gruel or dried fish, they were served canned meats, white bread that seemed impossibly soft, and butter in neat portions. Some received processed cheese, a product they had never encountered, while others bit into fruit preserved in syrup, its sweetness overwhelming. And then came Coca Cola. To American guards, it was routine refreshment, but to the prisoners, it was baffling. A drink that gave no nutrition, no sustenance, consumed purely for pleasure, and still plentiful in wartime. Some prisoners were convinced it must be a trick, while others stared in disbelief as American soldiers casually downed bottles one after another. This abundance carried an unspoken message. America's ability to feed even its enemies better than Japan could feed its own troops was more than hospitality. It was propaganda without words. The Geneva Conventions required decent treatment, but what the prisoners experienced went far beyond obligation. They saw a nation that could afford to uphold both law and generosity. Even the casual way meals were delivered, in standardized trays with portions neatly divided, reflected a kind of efficiency the Japanese military had never mastered. It was discipline of another sort, not forged by hardship, but by industrial design. At first, many prisoners resisted. Refusing food was a gesture of loyalty, a last grasp at the honor they had been taught to protect. But hunger eventually dissolved resistance. Slowly, men who had once sworn to die before surrendering began to accept American meals. With each bite, they were forced to acknowledge a reality they could not ignore. America fought with abundance, and Japan fought with emptiness. The soft bread, the canned fruit, the ever-present Coca Cola, all of it seemed to whisper the same truth. The war was never balanced. For the Americans, these first captives were not just prisoners to be contained. They were living proof of a cultural divide. The guards, many of them small-town boys, watched with fascination as hardened Japanese soldiers stared wide-eyed at ordinary items like chewing gum or chocolate. The astonishment worked both ways. In the silence of the mess halls and the shared labor of camp routines, two worlds met, collided, and began, however slowly, to understand one another. For the Japanese, the first captives discovered something far more powerful than the weapons that had defeated them. They discovered that in modern war, abundance itself was a weapon, and America wielded it with ease. For the Japanese prisoners, Coca Cola was more than a drink. It was a revelation. The fizzy sweetness exploded on their tongues in ways rice wine or barley tea never had. It was strange, indulgent, and utterly unnecessary for survival. Yet the Americans treated it as casually as water, serving it to soldiers, civilians, and even prisoners in camps thousands of miles from the Pacific Front. To men who had grown up in a culture of rationing and frugality, the question was unavoidable. How could a nation at war produce something so frivolous in such staggering quantities and still win? The answer lay in America's mastery of the assembly line. By the early 1940s, Coca Cola had become inseparable from the U.S. military effort. The company pledged that every American in uniform would have access to a bottle of Coke, no matter where they were stationed. Bottling plants sprang up near bases from Africa to the South Pacific, churning out millions of bottles a day. For the Japanese, who were accustomed to scarcity in even the most essential goods, the very existence of such a system seemed unreal. A single company devoted to producing pleasure in a bottle had managed to build a distribution network as vast and sophisticated as Japan's entire war supply chain. The hamburger told a similar story. To the prisoners, the idea of ground beef sandwiched between two mass-produced buns was both alien and ingenious. Japanese cuisine emphasized tradition, craft, and seasonality. Meals were prepared with care, often requiring hours of work for modest portions. The hamburger flipped this philosophy on its head. It was designed for speed, efficiency, and repetition. Every patty looked the same, every bun tasted the same, and every meal could be produced in minutes. It was industrial food, the edible cousin of tanks and airplanes rolling off Detroit's assembly lines. To the captives, it revealed a society that had learned not just how to produce weapons, but how to mass-produce satisfaction itself. This standardization carried enormous implications. To the Japanese, uniformity often meant compromise, a decline in quality or refinement. But in America's case, uniformity meant reliability. A hamburger in Wisconsin tasted the same as a hamburger in Louisiana. A bottle of Coca Cola opened in Texas, fizzed with the same sweetness as one uncapped in New York. That consistency reflected a larger truth about American power. The same networks that delivered hamburgers and soda to camps could also deliver ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies to armies stretched across two oceans. Mass production wasn't just about goods. It was about the assurance of supply, the predictability of abundance. Some prisoners initially mocked this efficiency, calling it crude and soulless compared to Japan's traditions. Yet over time, many began to see it differently. What they once dismissed as softness began to look like strength. Lieutenant Masao Fujiwara, a naval aviator who worked in a camp kitchen, later admitted that preparing trays of hamburgers taught him something profound. I realized that Americans had built a society where pleasure itself was mass-produced, and yet it didn't weaken them, it strengthened them. They could make comfort into a weapon. For men raised to believe that luxury led to weakness, this was a revelation that cut deep. In the end, Coca Cola and hamburgers became symbols of something larger than taste. They were proof that America's war effort was fueled not only by steel and oil, but by a culture that could industrialize joy. For Japanese prisoners, every sip of Coke and every bite of a hamburger underscored the same humbling reality. They had underestimated an enemy that had learned to harness abundance with the same precision Japan applied to discipline. The assembly line had become America's secret weapon, and it was every bit as decisive as the aircraft carriers and bombers that ruled the Pacific skies. Step inside an American prisoner of war camp in 1943, and you would not find the bleakness that Japanese soldiers had feared. Instead, the camps operated like small cities, humming with routine, order, and an abundance of resources. Rows of neatly built barracks stretched across fenced compounds, each equipped with electricity and running water. Mess halls stood at the center, their kitchens stocked with industrial stoves, mixers, and refrigeration units that seemed futuristic to men accustomed to cooking over open fires. The first impression many prisoners carried was not of punishment, but of efficiency, an efficiency so precise it felt almost mechanical. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and Camp Livingston in Louisiana became names whispered with disbelief among Japanese soldiers. Each facility could house thousands, yet every detail appeared standardized. The barracks followed identical blueprints, the dining halls served meals at set times, and supply trucks rolled in daily like clockwork. To men from a nation stretched thin by shortages, the predictability of this abundance was staggering. Food was not only plentiful but varied, rotating through menus that included meat, bread, vegetables, and even desserts. Many Japanese prisoners admitted later that they ate better in captivity than they had during their entire military service. Life in the camps extended beyond meals. Recreational facilities were built into the compounds. Libraries with shelves of books, fields marked for baseball and soccer, even movie screenings that brought Hollywood stories into the lives of men who had grown up with kabuki theater. The camps were not paradises, but they were undeniably structured to maintain morale. For the Japanese prisoners, these amenities were bewildering. Why would a nation waste effort entertaining its enemies? The answer, of course, was that for America, this wasn't waste. It was another demonstration of capacity. When you could outproduce the world, even generosity became a weapon of influence. Still, not all experiences were comfortable. The psychological weight of captivity hung heavily. Many prisoners wrestled with shame, knowing that surrender marked them as dishonorable in the eyes of their homeland. Yet the daily rhythm of camp life softened the edge of despair. Medical care was routine, clothing was replaced when worn, and labor assignments, from kitchen duty to maintaining campgrounds, provided structure. Guards, often young Americans from rural towns, gradually came to see their captives not as faceless enemies, but as men who marveled at baseball gloves, puzzled over jukeboxes, and stared in awe at ice cream machines. Slowly, barriers of fear and hostility began to erode. One of the most startling contrasts for Japanese soldiers was the casual flow of goods through these camps. Fresh produce arrived in trucks, industrial-sized cans of vegetables stacked neatly in storerooms, and shipments of cigarettes and candy distributed as if limitless. For men raised in a society where a single orange was a treasured gift, this abundance was nearly incomprehensible. Some prisoners began collecting scraps, empty bottles, paper wrappings, even broken utensils, not out of need, but out of reverence for materials that seemed too valuable to discard. The guards often looked on with bemusement, unaware of how deeply their routine waste symbolized America's unimaginable wealth. In the end, the camps became more than detention centers. They were classrooms of cultural confrontation. Every tray of food, every movie shown, every piece of candy passed across a table carried with it an unspoken lesson. America's power lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to create, to provide, to sustain abundance at every level of society. For Japanese prisoners, the camps were daily reminders that they had entered a world where victory was not earned through sacrifice alone, but through the relentless machinery of production. Inside those fences, they were not just prisoners. They were witnesses to the scale of a civilization unlike anything they had known. If abundance was shocking to Japanese prisoners, waste was devastating. In their culture, forged through centuries of scarcity, every grain of rice was sacred. Families rinsed cooking water to extract every trace of starch, repaired clothing until it was little more than patches, and saved even bits of string for reuse. To men raised in such frugality, watching American guards casually throw away food was almost unbearable. Half-eaten sandwiches landed in bins, bottles of Coca Cola were abandoned after a few sips, and trays of uneaten meals were scraped away, as if they were nothing. For the prisoners, this was not just surprising, it was incomprehensible. The shock lay not simply in what was wasted, but in how effortlessly it happened. Waste suggested surplus, and surplus meant security. In Japan, waste was impossible because there was never enough to begin with. In America, the system produced so much that even discarding food or supplies barely registered. Some Japanese prisoners began saving scraps of bread or empty bottles, treating them as precious resources. Guards often shrugged, amused by the habit, unaware of how profoundly it revealed the gulf between two worlds. What Americans considered trash, the prisoners saw as treasure. This casual waste forced many Japanese soldiers to reconsider the propaganda they had been taught. They had been told Americans were decadent, soft, and unprepared for true hardship. Yet here they saw the opposite. A society so productive, it could afford to discard what others would fight to keep. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Hayashi later wrote that what struck him most was not the abundance itself, but the ease with which they treated abundance, as if it flowed endlessly. To him, America's strength was not only its factories, but its confidence that tomorrow would bring just as much as today. The lesson of waste also highlighted the vulnerability of Japan's wartime strategy. Japanese forces stretched thin across the Pacific, lived constantly on the edge of starvation. Soldiers boiled weeds for soup, rationed ammunition, and reused bandages until they fell apart. Entire campaigns were lost, not because of battlefield defeat, but because supply lines collapsed under the weight of scarcity. The contrast with American behavior in prison camps was stark. If a nation could feed prisoners better than Japan could feed its soldiers, what chance did Japan truly have of sustaining a global war? For many POWs, the sight of a guard tossing food into the garbage was more demoralizing than the blast of an American bomb. Over time, waste became a silent teacher. Japanese prisoners who once clung to the idea that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage began to see the futility of that belief. Spirit could not create bread where none existed, nor heal a wound without medicine. America's waste revealed a deeper truth. In modern war, the ability to produce endlessly was the ultimate strength. For some prisoners, this realization was humiliating. For others, it was enlightening. It forced them to recognize that the war was not just lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in the factories long before. Yet even within the despair, there was a seed of inspiration. Some prisoners began to study America's systems with fascination. They observed how kitchens operated, how supply trucks delivered goods, how even discarded items were replaced without question. To them, waste no longer symbolized weakness, but resilience, a society so strong that it could absorb inefficiency and still thrive. This lesson, bitter as it was, would stay with many long after they returned to Japan. In the ruins of their homeland, where scarcity ruled every street, they would remember the strange sight of hamburgers tossed away and Coca Cola bottles left unfinished. And in those memories lay the blueprint for Japan's own post-war transformation. At first, American guards and Japanese prisoners eyed one another with suspicion. The guards saw men who had fought ferociously across the Pacific, men who had been portrayed as fanatics willing to die for the emperor. The prisoners saw young Americans with rifles, casual in posture but frightening in authority. Yet over time, something unexpected began to happen. Food became the common ground, the quiet bridge that connected two sworn enemies. A hamburger shared across a table, a bottle of Coca Cola passed through a fence. These small acts began to soften the hard lines of war. Meals in the camps were often the setting for these subtle exchanges. Japanese prisoners marveled at ice cream, candy bars, and coffee, while guards chuckled at their wide-eyed reactions. Corporal James Mitchell, an Iowa farm boy assigned to Camp McCoy, later recalled that watching them taste Coca Cola was like watching kids discover fireworks. At first, the guards mocked the awe, but soon the novelty faded into something more human. They began to see their captives not as nameless soldiers, but as men who laughed, argued, and even smiled when given a simple treat. Food turned confrontation into conversation. The Japanese prisoners, too, experienced a shift. They had been taught to see Americans as decadent and soft, people incapable of enduring hardship. Yet sitting across from guards who joked casually while eating the same meals, they began to realize that comfort had not weakened their enemy. It had empowered them. The abundance on the table was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. And in that recognition, respect quietly replaced disdain. Many former POWs later admitted that it was not the guards' weapons, but their generosity that left the deeper mark. Beyond the dining hall, other forms of connection appeared. Guards taught prisoners how to swing a baseball bat, while prisoners showed guards how to fold origami cranes from discarded napkins. Language barriers were overcome with gestures, laughter, and the universal language of sharing a meal. On both sides, curiosity replaced hostility. For young American soldiers, many of whom had never traveled beyond their home states, the Japanese captives were their first encounter with an entirely different culture. For the prisoners, the guards were not the monsters wartime propaganda had described, but farm boys, students, and factory workers just like themselves. These bridges did not erase the pain of war. Guards still remembered comrades killed in the Pacific, and prisoners still mourned families under bombardment back home. But within the confines of the camps, human connection began to take root. A guard slipping an extra candy bar to a prisoner, or a prisoner carefully sketching portraits of the guards' families, became acts of quiet reconciliation. They did not end the war, but they hinted at what peace might look like. In the shadow of global conflict, hamburgers and Coca Cola had become unlikely ambassadors. In hindsight, these small bonds mattered far more than anyone realized at the time. They prepared the ground for the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States, a partnership that would grow out of mutual respect rather than endless hostility. The guards who once feared their captives carried home stories of Japanese soldiers who were not monsters, but men. And the prisoners who once despised American consumer culture returned to Japan with a new understanding that generosity, abundance, and shared humanity were as powerful as any weapon. In those camp dining halls, bridges were built not with treaties or speeches, but with meals shared across the table. For many Japanese prisoners, the true defeat didn't come on the battlefield. It came in the mess hall. Each meal served in an American camp was a reminder of the vast gulf between the two nations. As the weeks turned into months, the realization sank deeper. They had been fighting a war they could never win. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked will, but because they lacked what America possessed in overwhelming supply: resources. Every hamburger and bottle of Coca Cola was a quiet, undeniable proof of that imbalance. The contrast was brutal. In Japan, soldiers starved on remote islands, surviving on handfuls of rice or whatever they could scavenge. Civilians back home endured rationing so severe that meat became a memory and vegetables were scarce luxuries. Yet in American camps, food arrived daily in quantities so massive that guards thought nothing of throwing some away. For prisoners, this was not just a difference in diet, it was a difference in worlds. How could an empire built on scarcity compete with a nation that seemed to manufacture abundance as easily as it breathed? The industrial scale of America's war effort only deepened this sense of futility. Japanese prisoners saw not just the food on their plates, but the machinery behind it. Trucks rumbled in with deliveries like clockwork. Kitchens churned out standardized meals with assembly line precision. Even Coca Cola bottles arrived in neat wooden crates, identical and endless. For the prisoners, it was clear. If America could create this kind of system just to feed its captives, what could it do for its armies at the front? The answer was sobering. America was fighting with factories as much as with soldiers, and factories never tired, never wavered, and never ran out of will. This realization forced many to re-examine the ideology they had carried into war. Bushido had taught them that honor, spirit, and sacrifice were stronger than material wealth. But spirit could not replace calories. Sacrifice could not produce ammunition. Willpower could not conjure medicine where none existed. Watching America's effortless abundance exposed the fragility of Japan's faith in endurance alone. As one prisoner later reflected, "We were told we could overcome anything with courage. But courage cannot fill an empty stomach." The psychological impact was profound. For some, it was humiliating, proof that their homeland had sent them into battle on false promises. For others, it was strangely liberating. The shame of capture gave way to an understanding that the defeat had been inevitable, not personal. They had not failed. Japan's system had failed them. And in recognizing that truth, many began to shift their admiration toward the very society they had once despised. If this was what modern power looked like, perhaps Japan's future lay not in resisting it, but in learning from it. By the time Emperor Hirohito's surrender was broadcast into the camps in August 1945, the prisoners were prepared in some sense for the news. The defeat was no longer shocking. It had been written in every tray of food, every discarded sandwich, every crate of Coca Cola that rolled through the camp gates. The war had been unwinnable from the start, and the camps had made that painfully clear. For the men who sat quietly digesting both their meals and the enormity of that truth, it was the beginning of a transformation, one that would shape not only their return home, but Japan's place in the world to come. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japanese prisoners of war listened in stunned silence as Emperor Hirohito's surrender was broadcast into the camps. For years they had been told that surrender was unthinkable, that the emperor was divine, and that Japan's spirit would prevail. Now those illusions crumbled in a single radio address. In the days that followed, American guards informed the prisoners they would soon be repatriated. Relief mixed with dread. They were going home, yes, but home no longer meant the Japan they had left. It meant ruins. The journey back began with a final demonstration of American abundance. Prisoners were processed through staging areas with methodical precision, new clothing issued, medical exams conducted, and care packages distributed for the voyage. Inside those packages were items that felt almost surreal: chocolate bars, canned meat, cigarettes, and bottles of Coca Cola. For men who had grown used to scarcity, it was a last, almost mocking reminder of what America could provide, even at the war's end. The ships themselves, Liberty vessels mass-produced in American shipyards, embodied the same message. The United States could build an entire fleet faster than Japan could repair a single battleship. As the ships neared Japan, reality struck. From the decks, prisoners saw the devastation with their own eyes. Cities lay flattened by firebombing, harbors were choked with wrecks, and factories once thought mighty were reduced to twisted steel. Tokyo, once the beating heart of the empire, was a skeletal landscape of rubble and ashes. For many, the sight was unbearable. They had left a proud, rising empire. They returned to a broken nation struggling to feed its people. In their hands, they clutched Coca Cola bottles and candy bars, bitter symbols of the contrast between the world they had witnessed and the one to which they were returning. Reunion with families was equally heartbreaking. Loved ones were gaunt from hunger, homes had vanished in flames, and entire neighborhoods were gone. Former prisoners found themselves describing the abundance of American camps, hamburgers, ice cream, soda, to relatives who had spent years boiling grass and scavenging roots just to survive. Some relatives couldn't believe the stories. Others listened with envy and despair. The shame of surrender now carried an additional weight. knowledge of a world where abundance was possible, a world that made Japan's suffering feel even more senseless. Yet amid the ruins, the lessons of captivity began to shape new perspectives. Some former prisoners quietly admitted that America's abundance had impressed them more than its bombs. They spoke of factories that never stopped, of trucks that never missed deliveries, of food that seemed endless. They had seen firsthand what industrial strength looked like, and they knew Japan's future depended on learning from it. In the rubble of destroyed cities, those memories became seeds of transformation. Instead of clinging to the old codes of sacrifice and scarcity, many began to imagine a different Japan, one that could embrace efficiency, productivity, and abundance. The return to ruins was painful, but it was also a turning point. The men who had once sat in disbelief at American hamburgers and Coca Cola now walked through their shattered homeland with a new understanding. Japan could not rebuild by returning to its past. It had to adapt, to learn, and to adopt the very methods it had once despised. The prisoners carried home more than just the shame of defeat. They carried knowledge, the kind of knowledge that would, in time, help Japan rise from ashes to become one of the most prosperous nations in the modern world. The men who returned to Japan from American prison camps carried with them more than memories of defeat. They carried an education. For months, they had lived inside small cities of abundance, where trucks arrived with precision, kitchens operated like factories, and even leisure was mass-produced. These experiences planted seeds that would grow in surprising ways. In devastated towns where scarcity still ruled every street, former prisoners quietly shared stories of hamburgers, Coca Cola, and industrial plenty. At first, neighbors dismissed them as exaggerations, but in time, those tales began to sound less like fantasy and more like a blueprint for survival. Occupation authorities soon introduced American goods and practices into Japanese daily life, and many former POWs found themselves at the center of this cultural shift. They explained the appeal of Coca Cola to curious civilians or the efficiency of assembly line food preparation to local entrepreneurs. What once symbolized humiliation now represented possibility. The hamburgers and sodas that had shocked them in captivity were among the first American exports to find eager customers in post-war Japan. Far from rejecting these symbols of abundance, Japanese society embraced them, adapting them into a new cultural identity that balanced tradition with modernity. Some ex-prisoners even became entrepreneurs, applying what they had seen in camp kitchens and storerooms. They started businesses built on efficiency, standardization, and mass production. Concepts that had once seemed crude, but now proved invaluable. Others became educators, teaching a younger generation that productivity and innovation were not the enemies of honor, but the engines of prosperity. A few entered government service, where their first-hand knowledge of America's logistical power influenced Japan's policies during Reconstruction. In countless small ways, the lessons of captivity shaped the nation's rebirth. The transformation was not only economic, it was psychological. For centuries, Japanese culture had emphasized endurance through hardship, the virtue of sacrifice, and the nobility of scarcity. But the war had shown the limits of those ideals. Abundance, once dismissed as weakness, was revealed to be strength. Efficiency, once seen as soulless, was recognized as discipline of a higher order. In this shift lay the foundation of modern Japan, a society that prized both precision and productivity, both tradition and innovation. The seeds planted in prison camps blossomed into factories, corporations, and cultural exports that would one day rival America's own. By the 1950s and 1960s, the transformation was visible to the world. Coca Cola was bottled in Japan itself, McDonald's opened its first restaurants, and Japanese companies like Sony and Toyota began to master the same principles of standardization and efficiency that had once left their soldiers in awe. What had begun as humiliation inside a camp mess hall had become a national rebirth. The prisoners who had stared in disbelief at hamburgers and Coca Cola lived to see their children grow up in a society where such foods were ordinary. symbols not of defeat, but of prosperity. The legacy of those encounters endures even today. The POWs discovered in American prison camps that true strength was not only the willingness to endure, but the capacity to create. The hamburger and Coca Cola were never just food and drink. They were lessons in abundance, efficiency, and the power of mass production. Out of the ruins of war, Japan built a future that mirrored those lessons, a future where scarcity gave way to plenty and despair to innovation. In the end, the seeds of transformation were not planted by bombs or treaties, but by something as simple and as profound as a meal shared in captivity.